My job is to go where wars are. I fly to places where other people are leaving. Sometimes I look around at people going to work in their suits and their briefcases on the train, and I wonder what it's like to have a normal life, where you go to work in the morning and come back in the evening and don't have to worry about being shot at or kidnapped or being in a war, and you know that you won't end up in a video with one of those knives at your throats. Occasionally, for light relief, I get to do natural disasters. Floods, earthquakes, maybe a famine. In my fridge, between the bottles of Sauvignon Blanc and tomato ketchup, I have a cholera vaccine. And in my wardrobe, where most women keep their little black dress, I have a flak jacket. Sometimes this leads to extreme situations. 10 years ago, on the 18th of October 2007, when I should have been at my son's school parents' evening, I was on Benazir Bhutto's bus when it was blown up in Pakistan's biggest ever bomb. I'd known Benazir for 20 years. In fact, she had a huge impact on my career. When I was starting out as a young intern at the Financial Times, she was opposition leader of Pakistan, living in exile in London, and I interviewed her. And the day that I interviewed her, she announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. A few months later, the most beautiful gold-inscribed wedding invitation landed on my doormat. That wedding was my first introduction to Pakistan. I'd never been there before. Of course, it was the most colorful of weddings. And every evening, after all the ceremonial events, there would be gatherings of Benazir's political colleagues, and they would be discussing how to topple Pakistan's then military dictator, General Zia. For me, working in local news in Birmingham, this was very different, not least because as the youngest female in the office in an area where we had lots of motorway crashes, one of my jobs was to go to see families of the victims and ask them for photographs of their dead sons or daughters. So I went to Pakistan to be a foreign correspondent. I had no idea what foreign correspondents did or needed. I started traveling with the Mujahideen, who were going off to war in fighting the Russians in Afghanistan. Not long after I'd been in Pakistan, General Zia was killed in an air crash, and Benazir became prime minister, though it wasn't long before the army got rid of her again. So when she went back after 9 years in exile, she asked me to go with her. I didn't intend to be on the bus. That year, I'd had a series of narrow escapes. I'd been in Helmand, ambushed by the Taliban. I'd been in a hotel in Peshawar that was suicide bombed. And when I spoke to Benazir before she went back, she told me about all the assassination threats that she was receiving. So I decided that I would go on the media bus behind. But when I got to Karachi and saw Benazir on top of that bus, I knew I had to be there. So I climbed on top, and it was very exciting. There were people everywhere, people up trees and on lampposts, on roofs, on streetlights. There was music, people releasing doves. But we were on top of an open-top bus that was going to go under 15 bridges and flyovers to get to where it was going. So I asked the man in charge of security, "How are you going to protect Benazir?" He looked at the heavens and said to me, "It's in God's hands," which I didn't find very reassuring. But the journey was long. There were so many people that we were 9 hours on the bus, and it got dark. We ordered in pizzas. We joked about getting breakfast on the bus. The streetlights were going off as we went ahead, as Benazir pointed out to me. And also the jammers that were supposed to stop anybody using remote control to set off a suicide bomb were not working. But we traveled for so long that I forgot about the danger. So it was a shock when suddenly there was a low boom, like the sound of a steel door dragging across concrete, and the bus lurched to a halt and we were thrown to the floor. The music stopped. I'd been in suicide bombings before, and I knew that often there's a second blast, much bigger than the first blast. So I shouted at people, "Don't get up." But within a minute, there was a much bigger blast, and then there was orange flame everywhere, and then silence, and then sirens. 3 people had been killed on top of the bus, but the rest of us were very worried that the fuel tank underneath us would catch fire with all these flames. So we jumped off the top, and we ran through the streets, through the blood and the body parts and the discarded shoes. 150 people were killed that night. Afterwards, when I was in the shower washing off the bits of flecks of burnt flesh of other people, I thought maybe it's time to quit. I'd had more than my 9 lives. But my first night back in London, I went for a dinner to honor a brave human rights lawyer, Beatrice Mtetwa from Zimbabwe. I'd spent a lot of time reporting from there, even though British journalists were banned, and I'd actually been declared an enemy of the state, accused of writing about corpses on golf courses. So I said to Beatrice, "I don't know whether it's worth the risk that I'm putting other people in to go and speak to them when it doesn't make any difference." And she said to me, "If people like you don't report what people like me do, what is the point of what we do?" But sometimes I wonder, is bearing witness enough? Sometimes I think about all the atrocities that I'm reporting on, and it doesn't really seem to make any difference. I've been a reporter for 30 years, but over the last year, I've seen worse things than I've ever seen before. In northern Nigeria, where you may remember 3 years ago, around 200 girls were abducted from their school in Chibok, which made headlines for 2 weeks. And I went there and discovered that actually thousands more girls had been abducted, unreported. And when I spoke to them, they had terrible stories about being gang raped by Boko Haram fighters and forced to marry them. Some of them had escaped and were in camps, but they told me that their own families wouldn't take them back because they saw them as being sullied, or they were worried that they'd been indoctrinated. So, in fact, one of them, a little girl, had been so badly raped that her pelvis was so damaged that she couldn't walk. She shuffled like a crab. And then there were the Yazidi girls, 5,000 of them abducted by ISIS and sold for less than the price of a cigarette packet. I spoke to one of them who'd been released, a 16-year-old, and she told me that the worst night of her life was when her captor, a fat judge, brought back a 10-year-old girl and raped her in the room next door to her as she cried for her mother all night. This may sound odd, but in the old days, after reporting on stories like that, I would go home and move on to the next story. But now, with WhatsApp, you remain in contact with the people that you've interviewed and what happens to them. Last year, I was in the Greek island of Lesbos interviewing refugees who'd been stranded in camps there. And I met a young girl from Afghanistan who I wrote about. And afterwards, she sent me a message. And she said to me, "I saw the article that you wrote. What difference does it make to me?" Sometimes people ask me, "Why do you do it?" And that's easy. Because actually, it's in the darkest skies that you find the brightest stars. I think about some of the people that I've interviewed. I told you about Beatrice Mtetwa, who has dedicated her life to taking on the atrocities of the Mugabe regime. But in 2001, after the Taliban fell, I was in Herat, and I met a group of women writers who literally risked their lives to be able to write. They thought about what could they do as women under the Taliban. The only thing they were allowed to do was sew. So they set up something called the Golden Needle Sewing School. And they would go there. Actually, the teacher was a professor of literature. And under their material and sequins in their bags, they had copies of James Joyce books and Virginia Woolf. They never made a single garment. And then a few years ago, I was lucky enough to work with Malala, who risked her life just for the sake of an education. And she told me that despite everything, despite being shot, she had no bitterness towards the people who shot her. In fact, she said she'd like to meet the gunmen so that she could explain to them why it's important for girls to go to school, if for no other reason that their own sisters and mothers could be treated by female nurses and female doctors. One of the great things about working with her was that for all her passion and maturity and eloquence, when she was at home, she was just a normal teenager who listened to Justin Bieber and fought with her brother. In fact, my son said to me when she won the Nobel Peace Prize, "Mummy, how can Malala win a Nobel Peace Prize? She's always fighting with Kushal." Then there's Nujeen, the amazing Syrian refugee who crossed from Aleppo to Cologne in her wheelchair with her sister pushing her. She too was deprived of education because of her disability, and yet she taught herself from watching television, and she learned English from watching American soap operas. She told me how disappointed she was when she got to Europe that the food didn't look like it looked on MasterChef. And when she was on the boat on the dangerous crossing from Turkey to Greece, she listed the Romanov emperors to try and relieve her stress. I also met some of the widows on those beaches in Lesbos, on the Greek islands, who, despite the fact that they were very poor, would come and greet the refugees landing, bring them food and dry clothes and drinks, and more importantly, give them a hug to show that they were not forgotten. Then last month I was in Afghanistan again, and I went out with a group of amazing girl cyclists who are literally, as they bike through the streets of Kabul, have stones thrown at them, have men abusing them. But they said to me, when they were biking, they felt as if they were flying. Best of all, I met a group called the Guitar Girls of Kabul. These are street kids who scrape a living by selling scarves and chewing gum. And most of them had lost siblings in suicide bombings, one of the many suicide bombings that have happened in Kabul. And yet, when they played the guitars, they had the biggest smiles I've ever seen. These are the kind of stories I want to bring home in my suitcase, for they give me faith in humanity. Seeing the resilience of some of these people in these terrible situations make me realize that we're stronger than we think. Is it a coincidence that they're mostly women? I'm not sure. To me, women are the real heroes of war because they're the ones who feed, protect, and educate and shelter their children when all hell is going on around them. I see too that we women want the same things for our children wherever we are, and how we're stronger together, and how there is more that unites us than that divides us. So, I asked before why I go to war. Probably when you think of war, you think of danger and killing and death and destruction. I think of those things too. I hate those things. But when I think of war, I also think of these people that I've met, of these guitar girls who told me, one of them, that finding the guitar and something like that to do in this terrible situation was like finding a yellow flower among the rubble. I think in this time of alternative facts and fake news, all of us need to be looking for that yellow flower.